important thing for the Trump administration. So in that sense, I think all of those things are positives. But obviously, we'll need to see what the compliance is going to be on those, and whether or not there are other areas of conflict that pop up in the coming months.
Sorry, while you were talking, IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva has arrived at the event as the first one to do so. This is how it's going to be going from now on. He's going to be greeting all the leaders and the members that are attending the first session. Before I get to you, Professor Connolly, I would just like to remind everyone that the first session, the theme is toward a more connected, resilient world. That's to address the trade cooperation amid the ongoing sort of protectionism, and you touched on it, Professor Connolly. One highlight that I'd like to emphasize is that President Trump has already left, right? He might want to stay here for what everyone else is going to say about, global trade. What do you say about that?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily a snub to South Korea or APEC. Trump has this habit of leaving multilateral meetings early. And I think he made it quite clear leading up to the event that he was going to leave early, unlike maybe some NATO events in the past where he left unexpectedly. So I would say this is just more Trump acting like Trump. It does maybe leave the battlefield to China, right? China is the only great nation, the great economy here. We saw in the days leading up to the Trump-China meeting, this talk about a G2. Well, now it's kind of a G1 if Trump's off. I think he's on his way to Central Asia for a series of meetings. But I think in the context of APEC, it's not that big of an absence. The US representatives are still here. They're probably still going to be working on the wording for the joint statement, which hopefully we will have. So I would say maybe a sign that free trade can exist without the United States being the active engineer of it.
Right. So at this moment, Vietnamese President Nguyen Quoc has arrived. He's taking the picture before he enters the hall for the main session. Vietnam is a comprehensive strategic partner with South Korea, exceptionally close and vital relationship in terms of economy. So it's the order of entrance is we're not quite sure yet, but we will do our best to introduce everyone entering the room. Continuing with what you were saying, sorry to cut you off before. As you said, Trump's absence is not that big of a deal. So what does Xi's presence then say about this APEC?
Right. Well, I think it definitely demonstrates this Chinese desire to be a trading partner, to, if not take the American leadership in free trade, at least to demonstrate that it's still willing to participate in these international organizations and multilateral trade, especially after their joint meeting yesterday. I think we are a little worried about the future of the multilateral trading organizations, basically a one-year truce that the two great trading nations have established. Will it even last a year, right? The stock markets were a little weak this morning, which indicates that even a lot of the private sector is a little anxious about the stability between US and Chinese ties. So APEC does, though, represent a huge proportion of the world's GDP, even if we exclude the United States from it. So we can still have multilateral trade without the US going around the US, right? So we might see in the future more of a parallel trading system emerging where you have countries like Canada, Vietnam, Korea engaging in deeper and deeper economic integration, but maybe China, the United States, the EU being a little more protectionist and having these kind of silos in the global economy.
Right, and also I would like to mention that China will be the next APEC host. So we'll see, how China accepts the host role here in Gyeongju, because that's what happened last time when then President of Korea accepted the host role. Now, Professor Ritchie, another key aspect to APEC is AI cooperation, and South Korea likes sort of taking the lead in terms of global AI cooperation. What do you see in that attempt to do so here in APEC?
Yeah, first, if I can come back to the discussion briefly about Trump not being here and China taking over next year, I don't think I think I agree with Professor Connolly that Trump not being part of the multilateral meeting is not necessarily a snub towards South Korea, but it is a snub towards multilateralism. And it's just sort of highlighting the fact that Trump ultimately doesn't think that these types of bodies are either performing or that they're worth the attention and the investment of the United States. And that does make it, I think, more challenging for these multilateral organizations to deliver in a significant way on their agendas. So I think I would point that out. And then, with China being here, I think it's going to be interesting to see how they take the baton from this year's agenda and turn it into their own agenda for next year.
Excuse me, Professor.
Yeah, sure.
I would like to say the United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has arrived at the scenes. Speaking of the United States, he's also been at the control center for the trade negotiations with other countries. If what we prepared so far is correct, we will be going the opposite of alphabetical order of guests, but we will not be sure until we're farther down the list. Now, Professor, let's continue with what you were saying. Sorry to cut you off. Yeah.
No problem, of course. On AI, the thing really, of course, is that South Korea, I think, has differential interest in artificial intelligence, in the sense that it is a tech leader, and AI is increasingly going to be a part of what it does, whether in the tech innovation space. Whether that be the types of chips that it ends up producing, or the way that it incorporates AI into its own large language models that it produces here.
Right.
The way that it's going to incorporate this into its military, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, sir.
Sorry. Thai Anutin Sharnivirakul has arrived. Of course, a close friendly nation with South Korea, a key ally during the South Korean War. The partnership is strong in trade, tourism, and investment. So it's good that President Lee was able to meet with the president, with the Thai leader. Sorry.
No worries.
Yes. So AI.
So on the one hand, South Korea has a real interest in being an out in front, what we call bleeding edge leader, in this area, really pushing forward on an AI agenda. On the other hand, as a middle power, South Korea, I think, needs to be a part of an effort to regulate and govern artificial intelligence. And in fact, last year there was an entire military use of AI conference here, Congress here, to discuss how to use it responsibly. So that's an important part of the agenda as well.
Right.
I'll let you handle the.
Thank you. So Taiwanese Capital Chairman Lin Xin-yi has arrived. Now, it's something. Taiwan is also a friendly nation to South Korea, but former diplomatic relations were severed in 1992. But an unofficial relationship exists, of course, as Taiwan's relationship with many other nations around the world due to its diplomatic status. Now, that's according to our beloved reporter An Sung-jin's list that I've shared with you guys, that we've prepared for all these members, key facts.
I would point out Taiwan's a great example of what I'm talking about. Taiwan's a competitor of South Korea, but also a partner of South Korea. And so in the AI space, they both want to push forward on AI because they both want to, capture market in this area and sort of set the standards for how AI functions. At the same time, they both need it to be governed well because they would both potentially be subject to, for instance, Chinese or North Korean use of AI in the military that could endanger their own countries. So they have a sort of dilemma in terms of how it is that they want to regulate this, and so one of the things that South Korea is going to have to do in this type of multilateral setting is figure out how it's going to set up the agenda on regulating and governing AI.
Right. Now, Lawrence Wong, the Singaporean Prime Minister, has also arrived. Professor Connolly, would you like to share anything about Singapore?
Well, it's, I think, a really important trading partner in the region, and I think it exemplifies what we've been talking about already today, how the role of middle powers. If you think about financial centers in Europe, they've historically been the great powers, right? London, New York. But in East Asia, it's some of the smaller states that have this ability to act as hubs or financial centers. And South Korea especially, we were talking about AI, President Lee has announced that he wants to be the top three, right? After the United States and China, which is, I think, a really interesting dilemma that Korea has. Is it trying to be a great power in terms of a great trading nation, an economic powerhouse, or is it more willing to be one of these smaller middle powers? And I would say in AI, it's trying to be a leader. And that gives it a chance maybe again to create benchmarks and best practices for the rest of the region.
Now, Russian Minister Alexei Overshuk is here at the scene with shaking hands with President Lee Jae-myung right now. Of course, at a very complicated relationship at this moment. APEC is something that Russia can't miss, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Russia needs economic development as much as everyone else. APEC focuses a lot on overcoming a lot of the technical trade barriers to trade. And Russia is being sanctioned because of its war in Ukraine. Participating in these forums is a much needed source of legitimacy for them. And Putin, of course, can't attend in person because he may be arrested.
Right, right.
So I think Russia's participation in these, and if we remember the last couple declarations as well, the war in Ukraine has sometimes featured in them. So you want to have a delegate here to try to
Oversight.
keep the wording the way you want it to be.
Yeah, yep. In terms of wording, Professor Ritchie, joint statement is a big talk of the town, right? Are we going to have it, or what does it mean to have one, would you say?
Yeah, so it's important, I think, for Lee to box through a joint statement, if for no other reason that failing to do so sort of dings the rewards that you get politically, both domestically and internationally, for hosting this. To some degree, you're punished a little bit for failing to push it through, although frankly, you don't get a lot of reward when you actually do produce a joint statement, because most people just consider these things to be, hot air and talking points and that sort of thing. So I think it is important, and I think one of the important questions is going to be what's in that joint statement, which we can come to in a moment after you introduce President Marcos.
We'll continue. President of the Philippines, Ferdinand Romualdez Marcos Jr. is here. Obviously, Philippines historically deep ties, fit countries to recognize ROK in 1947, and a key ally as well during the Korean War. The relationship is marked by strong trade, investment, and people-to-people exchanges. So, continuing with the joint statement, Professor, right?
Yeah, I certainly hope the relationship with the Philippines goes well, because they're a source of a lot of my bananas here. I think the thing about the joint statement, is that what to some degree, I think what's less important is the number of things that are on there, as opposed to maybe the things that aren't on there. And so one of the things I'll be looking for is whether or not there's a recommitment to global trade under the aegis of the WTO, or the World Trade Organization, which is usually featured in the previous joint statements. And it will be interesting to see if that's the case this time, considering the hostility that the U.S. has towards the WTO. Here we have...
Yep. Teresa Mera Gomez, Minister of Foreign Trade and Tourism of Peru. Right, and Peru also is a comprehensive strategic partner with South Korea. There's an FTA between the two nations. Cooperation expands beyond trade to strategic sectors, including critical minerals and defense. Now, Peru is also, one of the most aspired places to go for a tour for a lot of Koreans, even though it's all the way across the globe. So, very close relationship with Peru. Okay, so is there anything to add to the joint statement?
No, I think the only other thing I would add would be that we're likely to see some statements about connectivity as a part of the joint statement, how important that is both for developed and also developing economies. And so not only within their kind of own worlds, but also connectivity between those areas as a part of a sort of development economics. As I said, some type of commitment to open trade, whether or not the WTO shows up there is an interesting question. Sustainability will obviously be a part of it, and then cooperation for innovation. I can expect all of those things in some form or another to show up in the joint statement. And then the question after that is, what types of things are going to be benchmarked? What types of, of elements of governance are going to be a part of that? What types of pathways for cooperation in those areas, can be worked out either within the APEC context or then sort of flowing from that.
Okay. So for now, John Rosso, Deputy Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, is here. South Korea is key importer of Papua New Guinea's natural gas and minerals. So we do have a few that's already entered, and we're almost halfway through the visit, the leaders that are expected at the first session. Now, I'd like to remind everyone that the first session will focus on openness in terms of trade, and President Lee will give an address declaring that APEC has officially started with this main session and a speech to address, and it'll follow lunch, and there'll be a few more sessions before APEC closes tomorrow. Now, Professor Connolly, actually, let's introduce New Zealand's Prime Minister Christopher Luxon first before I get to you. New Zealand is a friendly nation with South Korea, of course. They participated in Korean War to support South Korea. There's a free trade agreement between the two nations. Now, New Zealand is a country population of 5.25 million people, yet they have a strong say among international community, right? And I think that goes back to your point about middle nations, maybe, right? Key strategic partners, right?
Right, and they're definitely hitting above their weight when you compare the size, yeah.
Right, and these international events will put up a stage for these, middle countries to sort of voice their needs and let them communicate with bigger countries, with bigger economies and more population. Now, next we have the Mexican Secretary of Economy, Marcelo Luis Ebrard. South Korea and Mexico also share a close relationship, strategic partner, and there's a lot of economic opportunity between South Korea and Mexico, especially considering the North American market with all the tariffs going on. A lot of South Korean electronics, cars, are produced in Mexico, used to be sort of exported to the United States market. So the close relationship between a lot of these American countries, right, in the Central America and North America, and also like Peru, South America.
I think it reflects this redirection of trade routes and supply chains that, think about the traditional North American free trade arrangements. Trump kind of overthrew that. Now you see middle powers creating their own trade networks to try to get around these tariff barriers.
And they're sort of in the same shoes, right, with South Korea, especially Mexico, a big exporter to the United States. So it'll be interesting what the leaders of these two nations can, talk about.
일본 총리입니다.
The Japanese Prime Minister Sane Takaichi has arrived. Now, the two already met last night. We'll get back to that point with the first summit between the two. She's just recently been elected as the Prime Minister of Japan, the first woman to serve in that role. Now, they got a lot of things to sort of address as the two, or recently having taken the roles, leadership of the two nations. I think the entrance intervals are speeding up, to be honest with you, right?
Yes.
I guess everyone has arrived, sort of waiting for their grand entrance.
And I should point out that, like, between Japan and Korea, we see a little less of this cooperation that we see maybe between Mexico and South Korea. That there's an opportunity there for more cooperation in this era of great power.
Right, there's room for improvement for sure, right?
No.
Especially during the tensions in East Asia,
Yeah.
and so we'll get back to what happened last night between the
Malaysia
two
총리입니다.
leaders. The Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has also arrived. Now, Malaysia is a big country in Southeast Asia, of course, strategic partner with South Korea. It's, growing from trade to high-tech sectors and AI. So a lot to work with for South Korea and Malaysia.
Malaysia is really important, of course, obviously, as one of the hubs for ASEAN. South Korea is trying to diversify its supply chains. It's trying to diversify its diplomatic and economic partners. It's trying to diversify, sources for critical inputs, including, notably, raw materials, commodities, critical minerals, and things like that. And Southeast Asia is an important part of that, and ASEAN in particular is sort of the central hub for all of that. And of course, Ibrahim himself, just chaired the ASEAN-focused meetings just before APEC. So he's actually had quite a whirlwind week himself, and apparently quite successful. He was really hugely praised by Trump for the way that he handled the multilateral meetings down in Kuala Lumpur. So he's following on here, and at least in some ways probably trying to build some momentum and steam forward on multilateralism, even without the United States being a significant supporter of that type of mechanism.
Right, and another key player in Southeast Asia, Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto has arrived. Indonesia, I like to note, that has a population of 285.7 million people, and of course a close relationship with South Korea, special strategic partnership. The KF-21 fighter jet project collaboration was a big deal between the two nations in recent years.
And I think if you take a look at that population figure, I think this is also a reminder that there's a lot of markets other than the United States. And a lot of these Indonesians are going to be middle income in the next 10, 20 years. And there's a lot of opportunities for Korean businesses in this region.
I'd also note, of course, that KF-21 project didn't always go very smoothly. There were some real problems with some potential espionage involved in the story. There was a problem of non-payment by Indonesia. I think it's been worked out, if my understanding is correct. But it was a bit of a hot topic for a while, which just shows that states don't always get along, but they can put their differences behind them.
Right. Now, Hong Kong's Chief Executive John Lee is here. Relations, of course, primarily economic. Major financial hub for trade between South Korea and China. And investment promotion and protection agreement is in force between the two parties. There isn't many multilateral scenes that Hong Kong participates, right? Yeah.
Right.
So
Right.
this is a key event, especially for Hong Kong.
I think maybe this is a sign too of APEC's uniqueness, right? Where you have Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, United States, Russia. There's not that many economic
you got to
forums
be
with
careful
this.
because you can't just say nations for APEC. It's got to be economies or members.
Exactly.
So that's a difference in terms of this and G20 or G7, some other annual multilateral events that we cover.
And of course, the huge private sector involvement as well, the CEO summit and everything.
Right, the CEO summit, the ABAC, which is the business council for APEC members.
칠레
Now,
대통령입니다.
Chilean President Gabriel Boric Font has arrived. Chile and South Korea diplomatic relations since 1962. It's centered on 2004 Korea-Chile Free Trade Agreement. Chile is a key partner for critical minerals. Now, of course, critical minerals are crucial for South Korean economy, right? You know, some of the for whether it's batteries or semiconductors. So it's important that these bilateral relations also stay strong, right?
Yep, absolutely. And I think it also shows that within the context of APEC, we have developed economies that focus a lot on free trade, but we also have a lot of developing economies or economies that are primary goods producers. So there's a lot of different perspectives in the context of APEC, which means, how to reconcile all these interests is something that every host has to keep in mind.
Right. Now we're waiting. Now we've only got a handful left to enter. So we're still waiting for some of the big players here. Chinese President Xi Jinping isn't here yet. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney also hasn't arrived yet. So we're expecting some key figures to also enter. And for the time being, however, I would like to remind everyone, if you're just tuning in, that the first session is going to be focusing on sort of the trade scene amid the global protectionism, especially with the tariffs imposed on countries by the United States. Now,
카나다 총리입니다.
speaking of tariffs, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has just entered. South Korea and Canada share a great relationship. Comprehensive strategic partnership. Of course, Canadian forces helped South Korea during the Korean War. There is a free trade agreement between the two nations. Now, there's a lot of Koreans, of course, in Canada, or Korean Canadians, excuse me, and the two probably have a lot to talk about, especially with the tariffs with the U.S., right?
Right. And Canada's looking for submarines these days, and South Korea is one of the contenders in this process.
Right. So we just saw Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, enter after shaking hands with President Lee Jae-myung. Now he's got only a couple left to greet before he heads in to declare official beginning of the APEC 2025 in Gyeongju. For those just tuning in, Arirang News has actually been covering closely about the APEC preparations and what's going on so far. And this is the live broadcast of the first session, where President Lee Jae-myung is continuing to meet and greet with all the leaders.
Tell you, you mentioned earlier about Trump being gone and what that meant for APEC. I'll say one person who probably is happy that he's gone is Mark Carney.
Yeah, right.
The relationship between Trump and Carney has not been particularly great, really throughout most of Trump's tenure. And then, of course, most recently, an advertisement coming out of Ontario, criticizing the U.S. tariff policy, again inflamed the relationship. And my understanding is that the dinner a couple of evenings ago had Trump and Carney sitting across from each other at one of the tables, and I think that there was a sort of barely contained disdain, or maybe not even contained disdain by Trump for Carney. So my guess is that Carney may be happy that he's gone. And I guess I'd say to some degree there might be some sense that maybe South Korea is perhaps partially relieved, and maybe other APEC countries are partially relieved that Trump isn't there. simply because his obstinance towards agreements and his mercurial nature, might make discussions and potentially, signing, a joint statement more complicated. So, perhaps I'm going too far saying they're happy he's gone, but they're probably at least in some way relieved. And I guess I'd also say, with respect to Canada, again, middle powers trying to find their way around the great power competition and around, especially the United States as a sort of new kind of revisionist trade power. A perfect example of that is what we've seen South Korea and Canada set up over the last few years, notably with a critical minerals partnership, which is extremely important in the battery sector, for instance.
Right. Now, Anthony Albanese, Australian Prime Minister, has just entered. Of course, Australia and South Korea also great relationship, comprehensive strategic partners. Shared interest in the region. Needless to say, Australia has participated also in the Korean War to support South Korea. And a fun fact, South Korea is Australia's fourth largest two-way trading partner. So a lot already going on between the two.
And it's really a complementary relationship,
Right.
in some ways even more so than Canada. There's a lot of similarities, with respect to the complementary of their economies, but Australia is, if anything, even a bit more present in the sense that it's a purchaser of South Korean arms, for instance, in addition to obviously other industrial goods, and of course, much like Canada, it serves as a source of raw materials and critical inputs into South Korea's industrial economy. So that's a very important trading relationship and a very important strategic partner for South Korea.
Right. Now, we have two leaders to greet, according to what I have. We have Brunei and China still yet to arrive.
브루나이 국왕입니다.
Speaking of, Hassano Bolkiah, Sultan of Brunei, has arrived. Of course, Brunei, only a population of 466,000 people, but GDP of 15.68 billion US dollars. A very rich country for its size. So
It's good to have gas.
yes,
Small country with large natural gas reserves is
Right.
the way to go. I'm sure that they're happy about that because I'm not sure what else they have to offer. But that's certainly important for South Korea, which purchases some of their LNG.
right. This, as I said, despite its size, a key player in Southeast Asia, Brunei, Sultan Hassano Bolkiah has arrived. Now we are waiting, possibly the biggest name, now that Trump has left Gyeongju, Chinese President Xi Jinping is expected to be the next one to come, as he will be the last one to enter. And that
A
means
little bit of a power move coming in
it
late.
could be. And maybe it is, being that a lot of other countries don't have their top leaders at the event, it could be a way to respect the next host of APEC also.
I'll be interested to see how this handshake goes. China can't be happy with this nuclear naval propulsion outcome of the Lee-Trump meeting. They've already telegraphed that they're unhappy with some of the shipbuilding cooperation, with putting sanctions on Hanwha affiliates in the United States. And South Korea acquiring nuclear-powered submarines with the United States' blessing clearly is going to make China, I think, unhappy. So will be interesting to see how Xi Jinping looks as he's shaking Lee Jae-myung's hand. Of course, they've got a meeting coming up later.
Excuse me, sorry. Yes, UAE is actually participating as well. Khalid bin Mohammed Al Nahyan, Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, is here on behalf of the UAE leader.
The UAE is obviously critical,
Right.
Historically important within, recently historically important because of the nuclear power plant deal, the Al Baraka
with
nuclear
South
power
Korea.
plant deal. So there's a history there, and of course, obviously, that's one of South Korea's important inroads into the Middle East. To go back to China and Xi Jinping, Professor Connolly talked about a power move. I'll also be interested to see not only the expression on Xi Jinping's face.
Nuclear power submarines, like Professor Ritchie has
중국
already mentioned.
국가주석입니다.
Now we see Chinese President Xi Jinping, and as you said, the handshake is very important between the two leaders, and seems to be a composed. He's looking at the media right now. It's one of the big moments that APEC was supposed to serve the public when President Lee meets with Chinese President Xi Jinping during his first visit to South Korea in more than a decade, like I said. Now, President Lee will be heading into the main session for this year's APEC in Gyeongju. He's going to declare the beginning of APEC 2025 with a keynote speech, which we'll deliver once that starts. But for now, we're going to come back to the studio and sort of discuss what this means more. And now that everyone is in and they're preparing for a keynote speech, and we're assuming the speech is going to be on